So all of you have probably had a chance, at least for a few seconds, to look at all the names I have up on the screen. Probably you recognize at least most of them, if not all of them, right? So what if I told you that every single person on this screen is actually the same person? That in actuality, though they have very different things about them, like on the surface, there's little to no connection between Odysseus and Katniss Everdeen. But if you look closely, at their very core, they're all the same person. They're all a hero. That's what my project is about. My project's about heroes and the hero's journey, how the hero's journey has stayed the same over time, why the hero's journey is something that we're able to use to judge all of literature and create as a common ground between all of literature, but also how it's changed because culture's changed and how the change in culture has reflected everything else. So, over the course of the presentation, I will first explain what the hero's journey is and why it's this concrete thing that most of literature follows. I'll explain how it's changed, then I'll explain what it led me to do and what I've done as a result. So the first thing you need to understand when you're talking about the hero's journey is this guy. This is a very important person in the world of comparative literature. His name is Joseph Campbell, and he created something that's called the monomyth. The monomyth is this diagram. It's the idea that all of literature, every hero's story, whether it be Odysseus, whether it be Katniss Everdeen, whether it be Harry Potter or Frodo Baggins, that all of them always come down to the same sum of steps, these same 12 steps. That the hero always starts in the ordinary world, whether that be the Shire or Privet Drive or Ithaca. You always start in the ordinary world, you receive the call to adventure, refuse the call, and then find a mentor, and eventually you reach the climax, and then you come back home and you've got some sort of reward that makes the journey worth it. This is always what the hero does, right? Every hero's story, with a few changes here and there, follows this same basic timeline. And that's what Joseph Campbell talked about. A lot of famous scriptwriters since then have used this. Famously, George Lucas based his entire screenplay for the first Star Wars movie entirely off this list of steps. So it's really important when it comes to looking at how the hero's journey applies to basically all of literature, especially adventure and action literature. But if you twist the steps and look at them in a more creative way, you can really apply it to almost any story. How it's changed is really interesting, right? So the ordinary world is always where the hero starts, but what that ordinary world is has actually changed greatly over time. If you think of now the classic hero, right? There's a cliche where the hero starts as like an orphan. No one knows who he is and he's this like street urchin or something like that. That's what Harry Potter is. Katniss, I keep coming back to Katniss because she's a really prevalent one right now. She's like a low-down one in the coal mines, right? They're always like these low-down people. But then you look at the heroes of antiquity, you look at like Odysseus and Beowulf and Gilgamesh, and they were all kings to start with. So there's this huge disparity between the low-down people start from the bottom and get to the top. That's what like the modern hero story is, that's what the contemporary story is. But if you go back a ways, you find that the stories that all of these are based on are actually the opposite, and you're starting at the top, and you're defeating something for the whole people. That's what Gilgamesh does, that's what Beowulf does. And I have a theory about that. That's the biggest change I've noticed when comparing literature back then to literature now. And my theory is if you look at who's reading literature, right, is now most people can read. We have a relatively high literacy rate on this planet compared to what it looked like a couple thousand years ago. So if you're looking at who's reading, the stories are now for the everyday people, and that's why the everyday people want to see them being able to succeed. The everyday person wants to see that they can be a hero. But if you look at who could read when Homer was writing, if you can look at who was able to read when Beowulf, when Gilgamesh was written, it's the kings. They're bards who are telling stories to their kings, so obviously they want to tell a story. They want to tell a story about who they're telling the story to, because that's how you connect with your audience. So that's the most interesting thing I've noticed while studying the hero's journey. And I think that's a pretty logical reason for where it came from. What I did once I started thinking about this is I have written a book. This is the cover page for that book, and it's got red flashing lines to show how excited I am about it. I just finished this last week, and it's called All the Way There. It's a hero's journey in 11 parts. And so what I did, because my thesis is basically that the hero's journey transcends all of literature and transcends any genre, that it's present, omnipresent throughout literature. So what I've done is I've written the story, and I used 11 parts instead of 12. I twisted a little bit what Campbell and some other scholars have done. And I took the 11 steps and I made each chapter one of those 11 steps. And each of those 11 steps in sequence make up the hero's journey. And since I argue that this is so prevalent throughout literature, each step of this each chapter of this book I've written in a different genre. So The Ordinary World is third person when I've written it. It's third person, relatively no dialogue. It's about this warrior who's come home from war. But then the second chapter is about this young kid in like Brooklyn. He's very witty, he talks a lot, and it reads more like a YA spy novel. If any of you read like Alex Rider when you were little, that was my thing, and that's really what I'm basing these chapters off of. Each chapter I based off of something I loved, because this is kind of like a love letter to literature for me. The third chapter reads like Gilgamesh, like a translation of Gilgamesh, and then the fourth goes to a play. Over the course of it, we even get into a police report. Some parts of it read like Homer. There's even a chapter that my good friend Peter Shanahan drew, and it's entirely drawings. That's like a comics chapter. So my idea is that all of literature can be reduced to these steps, and because it's so prevalent that you can write each of these steps in a different style, with relatively little connecting the heroes between. They have similar names, and they're all guys. But other than that, there's nothing really connecting them except for the fact that they're heroes, and the hero story is always the same. So something got me thinking. So that's what I did. I studied the hero's journey, how it stayed the same, how the hero's journey is always the same. I always looked at how it's different. The main difference being who's reading it and how that affects. Your audience always affects what you're writing. What I was realizing as I looked at probably over 100 stories, right? And each of these stories I took a close look at, and I figured out that there's always a hero in these stories, right? Then I realized that people tell autobiographies, right? People always can write stories about themselves. So I realized that if all of our lives are stories, then you're always the hero. Thank you.